tell you, I've been asked by a group, maybe I can let you join. We have a group called the Caribbean Regional Coordinating Committee for the Pan-Alkebulan and Indigenous Movement. And basically, one of the things that has come up recently is to begin publishing Pan-African World, which would be like, start as a quarterly and increase to a monthly. And we want to use, I was talking, because Shabazz is part of the group, we want to use the youth voice methodology, because youth voice methodology was very sustainable from a financial standpoint. And if you're interested, I'll give you more information.
Okay.
Okay.
Our guest told me he was coming on, principal speaker. I haven't seen him yet. Mr. Atek.
Yes, hello.
Last time I heard you, you were in Spain. You were in Spain.
Yes, I was. It was a nice trip. A little vacation after 2.5 years.
Okay, good. Yeah, good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Yes.
Yeah, he's here.
He's on?
Yeah, he's here. Tell him to unmute.
Oh, yes. Comrade Roy.
Yeah, hi. Hello,
I see,
how are you?
Your photographs don't do you justice, man. You look younger. you kind of look like, what's the guy named Shahrukh Khan? Anyway, it's 6 o'clock. All our presenters are here. And we like to start on time. So at this point of the program, we turn it over to a founding member of the Seven Continents to do welcome remarks. Dr. Godfrey Vincent, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, members of Seven Continents, friends, colleagues, students, well-wishers, activists, comrades, I must say, scholars. My name is Godfrey Vincent, as Akko mentioned, one of the founders of Seven Continents, and we are here this afternoon to deliberate on a very important topic entitled Social Media and the Impact on the Caribbean. And we have with us this afternoon a PhD candidate, through Dr. Debroy, Dr. Bilindi from Tuskegee University, my former friend and comrade Felipe Noguera from Trinidad and Tobago, Dr. Tamanisha John from Clark, Atlanta. These are the 4 panelists who will be examining this critical issue. And before I present the first speaker, I was looking at a data here, and in the Caribbean, there are about 22.2 million people who are on social media. But there are also some negative things about social media concerning the Caribbean. They talk about human trafficking, crime, drug trafficking, money laundering, and a recent lottery scamming. So I guess the presenters will examine some of those issues. And so without further ado, I will call on future PhD professor, Dr. Roy.
Godfrey, before we do Dr. Roy, let me just do a short bio.
Oh, sure. Okay.
Yeah, so Dr. Roy is not a doctor yet, he's a PhD candidate. He was born in India, actually, in a town called Silchar. And at the moment, he is speaking to us from India. He's not in New Zealand. He's currently a PhD candidate in the Department of Sociology, Gender Studies, and Criminology at the University of Otago in New Zealand. His research focuses on Marxist theory and feminism and the analysis of working class social movements. His doctoral thesis takes root from his primary research interests, which are social, class, gender, social movements, space, the urban corporatization, and political economy. He also has an interest in a broad range of themes, including industrial relations, the sociology of sports, environmentalism, digital capitalism. His writings have appeared in peer-reviewed journals with some chapters in edited volumes spanning diverse topics. Apart from his doctoral research, he's working on certain long-term projects, the details of which will be updated in the near future. At the moment, today, he's going to speak to us from his most recent book titled Social Media and Capitalism, People, Communities, and Commodities. This book explores the role of capital in the formation of social media and related issues, a most important subject for us. And so I now introduce our author and featured speaker, a PhD candidate, Subrata Deb Roy from Silchar. And let me just say that Silchar is a small town, I think in the Assam state. So as we say in the Caribbean, he's from country. He's not from the big city, even though I think he's in Hyderabad now. So Subrata Deb Roy, the floor is yours. Please unmute your microphone.
Recording in progress.
Thank you, Ato. Thank you, and thanks for all the professors, activists, and comrades for having me here. It's such a nice thing to talk to people about your own work. Am I audible to everybody? Is my voice audible?
Yeah, we're hearing you. Yes, yes.
Okay. So without much, because of the schedule that was given, I won't go into much of a introductory thing. But thanks, Echo, for that wonderful introduction. But I do think that I need to edit it at some point because it's an old one which I prepared 1.5 years ago. But yeah, in due time. So coming to the topic of our discussion today, that's regarding social media. Communities and commodities and people, and how do different different factors feature in the discussion about social media in the broader context of the society that we all live in. Now, the first thing that I'd like to point out at this juncture is that why did that book actually was written? That book wasn't written as a book per se, because and I'll just go at the end. I hope that listeners will get to understand why, going a bit into history about how.
Hold on, please. Dr. Boone, please mute your microphone. Right, thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
So, because it's important to understand why did the book actually come up, because that will make a lot of things clear. Because see, it was intended to be just a study on a particular city in a particular country, that was New Zealand. And I did the study. But when I did the study, and because New Zealand falls largely, and it is a part of the global north, and when I did the study, I just came to realize at the end that certain conclusions that I had drawn from that study, and that paper is there available online as well. The certain conclusions that I drew from that kind of study, and I knew from personal experience, those were not relevant in the global south, especially in countries such as India, or even in countries where most of the audience today comes from. So that was what inspired me to write, to go towards a broader or a longer project, like talking about and discussing the various details of social media and the intricacies of the usage of social media in the global south, and sort of going into comparison with what happens in the global north. Within that entire domain of things which comes up regarding social media, my focus largely remains on the kind of trading practices which are there on social media, which are much more diverse and much more varied in the global south than they are in the global north. Now, in this particular talk, what I'll do is that I'll focus mostly on the global south because that's what I guess is relevant to most of us. But because like otherwise, I wouldn't simply finish it on time. That's why I focus mostly on the global south. Because so okay, so coming back to the topic, when we think of social media, the first thing which comes up is that it's a relationship between a particular means of communication which was devised uh, uh, later back, which was devised, and the society in general. That's why it's called social media. Media is sort of, it signifies a means of communication, and social is sort of the society. So what makes social media unique is the kind of participatory nature of social media. And if we look at literature which came up when social media, when initially we were going through this social media boom, was largely affirmative in nature. Like people, there were reports stating that social media will kind of bring in, it will democratize the media, it will kind of bring in a new kind of change within the lives of people, etc., etc. And some of those assumptions have come true. If we actually see the effect that social media had on some social movements, it has helped in the sort of in the news of the movement going forward, different views coming in, but the effects have largely been very limited. But as and when social media started getting institutionalized into the lives of common people, especially in the global south, different sort of methods emerged, different methods of accumulation emerged within social media. And one of them very specifically being things like Facebook Marketplace, things like Instagram Shops, things like Facebook Reels, and how you could monetize that. And and this is the important point. And I'm not doing self-promotion here, but the important point about this is that this is the topic which largely nobody speaks about. Like I found very little literature on this, very few academic studies conducted on this process, and especially when it has been going on for the last half a decade at least. And it's such a huge thing that in countries like the US and Australia, New Zealand, UK, that nobody has actually done a study on this, that how is this being used so widely. But there are certain points which actually come up. The first point which comes up, the first justification of these things which come up is like this trading on social media things, etc., which comes up, is that it's ethical consumption. Now, most of us would agree. I don't know the different, like there might be differences of viewpoints here, but ethical consumption, like, is still a part of a framework which decides to exploit and accumulate. You can't have consumption and like ethical consumption still leads to accumulation, like putting it very bluntly. And this entire trading thing on social media, it is a relatively new framework, but it does follow on that because like in the book, I quote certain interviews conducted with people who sell and buy on social media on a repeated basis, like mostly used products and all. And they actually work upon the thing, that work upon the idea that what they're doing is not causing harm to the environment or not causing harm to the society because they are buying a used product. They're buying a used product, they are spending money on legit things which have already been used, so that ecological footprint is lesser and all that kind of stuff. It comes up the general argument, and I have no problem with that. I have no problem with that. The problem starts, and in certain scenarios, I conducted interviews with both parties of the exchange, with both the seller and both the buyer. Now, the problem is not with the buyer. The buyer has got the commodity, he's using it, etc. So that's happening all fine. Now, when I conduct interviews with sellers, people who sell on social media on a regular basis, and the thing that you are selling on social media on a regular basis does mean that you are buying on a regular basis because that's why you have a lot of commodities to sell. You have a lot of commodities to sell, and that's because it's a chain reaction, it goes on and on. When I conducted interviews with them, regardless of where they are, most of them actually responded in the affirmative that the money that we get from selling the things that we have, we actually spend, most of us, most of them spend on the same kind of commodities again. And the entire point of my research for that particular book was that social media commerce or commercial activities on social media is not a part of any ethical consumptive framework. It's not a part of the alternative trading marketplace which can go on independently of mainstream capitalist processes, but it's very much a part of that process. And in some cases, it's actually beneficial to the mainstream accumulation process because that helps certain it helps certain individuals to garner enough consumptive powers which they can further use to buy from mainstream capitalists, mainstream capital, to get stuff from mainstream industrial capital, basically. Like in place of a better word to define it. So what social media allows people to do is that it allows people to use the community that they are a part of to extract profits and exchange them. That's one of the main problems that is there with social media. For example, if we look at the context of India, for that matter, and I'm pretty sure that similar events are there in the Caribbean as well. Because I have seen similar things happening in countries such as South Africa, not seen per se, but yeah, I have had similar exchanges with people who said the similar processes are at play in countries like South Africa, in countries such as even Zimbabwe, as well as in other South Asian countries. Is that networks on WhatsApp, networks on Facebook, networks on even in some places the networks on Instagram have helped create a diverse chain of retailers. I won't say that they are exactly retailers per se. They are a diverse chain of wholesale distributors, not wholesale distributors who have erupted in the last 3 to 4 years, who actually procure stuff from the producers directly and sell it to people. Now, this could have been a perfect example of ethical consumption per se, if we go to the exact definition of ethical consumption, if there wouldn't have been any profits involved, but there are profits involved. And so, and whenever there are profits involved, then we need to look at the larger perspectives which come into play with regards to the contradiction between capital and labor. What sort of capital is being invested and what kind of returns it is giving, what kind of profits is it generating, and what are the costs that the worker has to put in to that. So this is one of the stark differences. And you don't usually find such networks in the so-called advanced countries. These are usually traits which are available mostly in the global south. So that is one, and it has wide connections. It has wide connections with the kind of community that you have and the kind of community structure that is present in certain countries. Now, this is not something that has happened for the first time. Mainstream capital processes have been doing this for decades. They've been using communities for extracting profits. But the crucial point, what social media has done is that it has allowed members of the community themselves to turn into sort of a sort of micro capital, a personification of some sort of a micro capital which keeps the ball rolling. Now, if I go back directly to the text, to the book, in the book, what I talk about, sometimes I talk a lot in political economic terms in the book, which like one of the major issues with social media, trading on social media actually does is that it keeps cash in the market. So that actually helps a lot of, that actually helps, immensely helps the capitalist system in place because the capital is continuously in circulation. It's not stagnant. It continuously keeps on moving from one hand to another and ultimately aiding in the process of production, aiding in the process of accumulation, sorry. Now, in all this, the one point that I emphasize is that irrespective of all these networks and the kind of dynamics which are involved in this network, the important issue which is thrown up in global social media trading, global trading which happens to social media, is that because of late we have, like I have been documenting exchanges of commodities happening between countries as well. So it's mostly a global process these days. Is that we still need to theorize about the point of production and the contradictions which come with the point of production. So the problem is not, the issue is not, can't be the actual act of exchange which happens between two people who met through social media and all that. But the point still remains about this, the point of production and the basic contradiction which is still there between labor and capital, and how under a very developed capitalist system, certain relation between people come to be seen as a relation between things, and talking about the process of reification here. But we need to realize that they appear as relation between things because it might just be the case that under capitalism, relation between people appear as relation between things because that's what they actually are. That's what they actually are. And this is where actually we need to talk a lot about this idea of a dialectical understanding of contradictions, a dialectical understanding of contradictions between capital and labor, and how different aspects form a part of a whole, this entire machine of accumulation which come up, which works in the society. And their communities, people, social media, etc. So the scientific development itself has become part of a giant cognitive whole of capitalism, which actually leaves nothing unturned, which actually leaves no stone unturned to generate profits. With this, I think, yeah, my 15 minutes are over. So, yeah, I'm looking forward to interesting questions. But yeah, if I get questions, probably I'll be able to expand a bit more. But this is something that I prepared strictly keeping 15 minutes in mind. So, yes,
Okay,
thank you. Thank you.
we will have questions. Thank you. We will now have a response from one of our special guests, Dr. Bill F. Endy, who was born and raised in the British-speaking half of the Cameroon, Africa. He has traveled the world educating people. He began his academic career at the University of Yaoundé in the Cameroon, obtained his PhD from the University of Paris 8. He's an author of over 33 books. And Dr. Endy is a storyteller, playwright, critic, translator, philosopher, and has also practiced journalism. He's currently a professor of modern languages, communication, and philosophy at Tuskegee University in Alabama. So we now have Dr. Bill Endy from Tuskegee University and Cameroon to do his presentation.
Thank you very, very much, Brother Ako. And I'll seize this opportunity to first of all thank the Seven Continents Center for Research and Policy, as well as Caribbean Dialogue, for organizing this panel discussion and giving the opportunity to scholars to draw attention to the impact of social media on people around the world. So let me also salute my fellow panelists, Mr. Sudabrata, Deb Roy, Felipe Noguera, and Tamashina John. What I would like to say in this conversation, I would proceed like a storytelling. And having listened to the future Dr. Sudabrata talk about social media and capitalism, I would take a different tilt to point out that social media in its present form is a tool for enslavement, maybe a tool for re-enslavement. It tells us about social media allowing people to become a source of micro capital. But this is engaging people in a game without preset rules or without rules that are defined, and the people don't actually understand the what is at stake in the game. So I just like to delve a little bit into the history of innovations, and from there pointing out that the impact of social media, like most innovations, require time to understand and to grapple with fully. At times it takes generations, at times it takes centuries for anybody to have a good understanding of what is. And we realize with the advent of social media that opinions diverge on the merits and demerits of such an invention. And we realize social media is not like something that is half a century old. It is less than a generation old. I know the young people on the call who were born in this generation, they just believe social media has been around forever, but that is not the case, okay? And we realize that with the birth of social media, social media itself has birthed what we call the alternate facts, alternate reality, virtual reality, fake news, and what have we? So as stated prior in my claim of social media being a tool that enslaves, I know it would leave many listeners on this call very perplexed. However, if we understand that contemporary social media has a stranglehold on the younger generation, as it impairs rather than excite critical thinking, this would help us have an understanding, because through my studies of the phenomenon in social media, we realize the youths indulge in social media for ephemeral fame, distorted self-image. They are into schemes like the get-rich-quick schemes, and social media engrosses and immerses youths to the height of ridicule, as they tend, in the most part, to be defined by social media. And I'll just take a minute here to ask the young people on this call, how many of them would part away from social media for 1 week, or would leave their phone just lying there for 1 week? You can indicate by a show of hand or just raise your hands. Let me see. All right, I have 4, 5, okay? People indicating that they would be able to do this. But we see the responses are very few. And this is indicative of a trend not only lived and experienced in North America, but one that spares no part of the world, no matter how remote the part of the world. And I want to draw attention to tech algorithms, which are programmed with cookies to track every single action of users. The big techs, all right, sees the opportunity to cite their users. They want to know their likes and dislikes, their temperament, their sleep patterns, where and when individuals find themselves, the list could go on and on. And these social media algorithms are configured to make users comfortable with reassurances and not to make them anxious. That is why most young people would rather think they find solace and comfort on social media than with real human beings. This understanding brings to mind, no doubt, that the slave masters, when I say slave masters, understand big tech, have understood that slavery need not be under shackles, especially if and when one could have his or her slave enjoy his or her servitude and be a total part of it and be complicit in that role. I don't only limit it to that. We would realize that social media has become a tool for fomenting division and dissensions. We can talk about the polarization that is rife in our world today. It is not the product of some accident. If we want to talk, we could delve into the politics, not only of this nation, the United States, but you look around the world, what we are reading on social media about the ongoings are only things that create division rather than unite. So one may even be tempted to add the unspoken social media ethics. And I'll beg for clarification from other speakers if this ethics in their own research, if they found this ethics to be true, because the big techs are interested in profit first and people second. And this unspoken ethics only add to the tool bag of effective enslavement in the 21st century. Social media, which turns out to be a tool that most would think gives us freedom. It gives us the license to publish to anybody, which is something we should applaud as a great achievement, allowing people the right to free speech. And we know very well the right to free speech is very dear, because in many a dictatorship, such rights have been stifled. It has been chokehold. But the power to publish given to all by the social media has one of the greatest downsides, because it lures people away from taking time to verify the information that they are consuming. And that is why it is common for us to hear people say, because the internet says so. And I am tempted to ask, does this not comfort the claim that this generation seemed totally consumed with and defined by the social media? Take a stroll around TikTok, for instance. All the images you see are those of people taking their 5 minutes of fame. They are telling you all sorts of stories. Even if we take the fact that we have
Hold on, Elliot Howell, mute your microphone, please. Go ahead, sorry, Dr. Andy.
Okay, if we take even the fact that we have a recrudescence or a very big rise in motivational speakers on social media, the effect of the motivational speakers on social media has actually left the veracity and credibility of information affected, because these motivational speakers, could be anybody, could be you, and you wonder whether they're talking, basing the advice from any theory or any understanding of psychological theory that is. Also, we note that social media has driven many a young person to this kind of false and distorted idea of self-image, where young people tend to think what they see on the internet is what should be. But this is exactly not the case. And you would have young people wanting to think, well, with the social media, it is a place to meet people. But you are meeting people who are hiding behind their screens, texting you all sorts of information, people who in real life cannot carry a conversation, but on social media, they can write a whole book length about how great they are, okay? And the young people indulge, what do? They see such love relationship acted and played out on social media, and they cling onto it as if it were the greatest thing that ever was. Am I up with my 15 minutes or still have?
Yes.
All
Two
right.
more, take 2 more.
Okay, thank you. So the other thing I just want to draw attention to is the get rich quick schemes, which is not new. Like Mr. Sudabrajas pointed out, this idea of bringing in everybody as a source of micro capital incites everybody to think it is a way to get rich quicker. And they indulge in schemes. All of us on this call should have received an email or something from Nigeria telling you about money from one bank to be transferred and so on and so forth. But for you to do that, you need to send a little bit of this. All of this are some of the downsides we see on social media. And back into politics, you have opportunistic politicians who make use of the dissension flourishing on social media to create more division. With examples in North America, the former president pointing out that, well, if something happens to him, the rest of the world will not be at peace just because of that. That's a kind of whistle blowing. Not whistle blowing, dog whistle rather, that he is giving to his followers. If this happens, please do not. Now, social media has become, to me, in my conclusion, a place where material, which in the past were kept close to people's heart and very dear to them, like information people in the past put in their diaries and kept the diaries secret, away from public eye. It has become that marketplace for everybody to sell everything, including their dirty linens and their nakedness. I think I'll yield to that. I think my 15 minutes are up. Thank you all for listening, and I'll wait for your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Andy. We move on to our next speaker, who is Felipe Noguera, who was the Secretary General of CANTO, the Caribbean Telecommunications Organization. Also, he was the former head of communication at the 5th Summit of the Americas. He's currently the founding member of Caribbean Information and Communication Technology Virtual Community Civic. He's chairman of Global Harmony Communications, the Caribbean Mobile Network, and is the founder director of Virtual Educare Academy, a nonprofit organization that addresses the youth population. We now introduce Felipe Noguera.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. keynote speaker, the previous speaker, Dr. Ndi, Mr. Roy, all protocols observed. I asked to speak next simply because my notes on my laptop will be soon gone unless I was able to share them with you. Fundamentally in the Caribbean, since I was asked to speak about social media, its impact on people and communities in the and a perspective from the Caribbean and beyond. In the Caribbean, we are characterized by what's called a duopoly. There are two companies that provide telecommunication services, mobile and fixed, basically in the region, and they are Digicel and Cable and Wireless. And because the means of communication are not in the hands of indigenous operators, social media therefore provides a very innocuous distraction. I don't know if I would go as far as Brother Ndi and say it is dangerous, but certainly it can be. Keeping the Caribbean, Latin America, and African people on the margin or the periphery of the digital economy. I published a paper about 20 years ago at Harvard University called Bridging the Digital Divide by Creating Digital Multipliers in Developing Countries. One implication of social media, whether it's TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Meta, YouTube, WhatsApp, Signal, Cash App, et cetera, is that as long as it gives the customer affordable access, they're unconcerned about who benefits strategically or economically in providing the service. So therefore, things mentioned fake news, or augmented reality, virtual reality, and the options facing youth to develop critical thinking and problem-solving skills have not yet been given the time to determine efficiency. They might be saying, Professor Roy might be saying efficacy, but as Professor Ndi points out, you need longitudinal time to look at efficiency over time, and we haven't had enough time. Unfortunately, we may not have that much time in terms of the pedagogical approaches that we can consider. Local indigenous Caribbean operators, since I'm speaking about the Caribbean, have been largely restricted to app developers due to the high cost of infrastructure and licenses from competing in the Caribbean carrier market so far in our history. Consequently, the indigenous development of social media apps that could compete for social media market share is not generally encouraged. Speaking to my sons, my 22 and 25-year-old sons, some of the negative impacts of social media that they've shared relate to online bullying, pornography, access by and of children, predators and scammers posing as people they're not to find and exploit victims, unsupervised access by minors to inappropriate content, not blocked by apps, which can serve to undermine the moral values of children. Even then, I'm not talking about even pornography, I'm talking about things like Fortnite and Grand Theft Auto. Political adversaries, and I think, again, Professor Ndi mentioned this, political adversaries using social media such as Meta to gather intelligence from unsuspecting informants, which could be harmful to Caribbean sovereignty. Artificial intelligence bots, robots, gathering personal data, who took which and how many vaccines and who did not, including people's DNA, and exploit people economically without their permission or them garnering any material benefit. The invasion of privacy, creating a digital footprint that will not be erased. Right now, there are people contending to offer telecommunication services, that is, internet service providers, ISPs in the Caribbean, free, but it's not free. Anytime you're given something free, look carefully at the small print. If they're selling your data, it's not free. They're selling your soul. The duopolistic control of the means of communication across the Caribbean, with few exceptions. Now, some positive impacts: marketing, advertising, sales, some of the things that were mentioned by Mr. Roy, using social media to enable young entrepreneurs to enter markets with low capital outlay. Selling on the internet is usually predicated upon buying, as I said, electronically, and still having the options to pursue cooperative and collective equal exchange to counter the telecolonial control of the means of communications, establishing direct relations between producers and consumers. This is a possibility. How it's exploited is another issue. International voice, data, and video access via what they call OTT, or over-the-top services or apps, such as WhatsApp, Telegram, Signal, allow and facilitate those with access to bandwidth, because just because you have a laptop or a smartphone doesn't mean you have access to bandwidth to participate or to go on the internet. But those who have it can communicate with family and friends and conduct exchange, or use Alibaba or the other one, Amazon, to engage in commerce. But they're still dependent on the rates of the duopoly for buying and selling. And the embrace of digital currencies by growing numbers of Caribbean central banks will not only facilitate the uptake of homegrown Caribbean currencies, such as the African Kingdom's Lumi, that was developed in Accompong, Jamaica, and is based on both solar energy and gold, and has been also embraced by the African Union's African Financial Regulatory Authority. So this is a Caribbean developed currency that is now becoming digital, but is based by, it's not fiat, it is based by gold, and it's now converting solar energy as one of its resources. Social media is acquainting the region also as a positive with the Internet of Things, enabling extracurricular virtual education, the development of non-fungible tokens, and for marketing and sale of indigenous art. How well we're able to exploit it is another issue. I would close before my recommendations saying that for the most part, the Caribbean trade union movement has not been in the vanguard of applying technology, including social media, very effectively in mobilizing their membership and potential supporters. But maybe there's good reason for this. When 15 years ago, when the Arab Spring was using social media to mobilize what we thought was a breath of fresh air for the Middle East, it in fact was a Trojan horse used to topple the most progressive government in Africa, that is of Libya and Colonel Gaddafi. So we have to be aware of these Trojan horses. Finally, use of social media to create dynamic networks among the oppressed people, African and indigenous people, in particular in the Caribbean and across the world, with the Global South, as the brother mentioned, and to create something called the Caribbean Association of Indigenous Mobile Autonomous Networks. I started Canto more than 30 years ago. It's time that we make it indigenous and sovereign now. Finally, the students at Tuskegee, embracing the bold tradition of Booker T. Washington, George Washington Carver, the Tuskegee Airmen, can also embrace the Caribbean and African entrepreneurs and those attempting to develop our own apps so that we can communicate more directly, more securely, and in a more mutually beneficial manner. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brother Noguera. The next speaker is Dr. Tamanisha John, who is an assistant professor at Clark Atlanta University, where she teaches courses on international political economy, international relations, politics, and global issues. She has done work on financial exclusion, corporate power, and Canadian banking overseas. Her two most recent published works are Canadian Financial Imperialism and Structural Adjustment in the Caribbean, in Class, Race, and Corporate Power and Racialized Financial Exclusion in the Anglophone Caribbean. She holds a PhD in International Relations from Florida International University and an MA in Latin American and Caribbean Studies from Florida International University as well. Her research interests include Caribbean sovereignty and politics, settler colonialism, island economies, transnational corporations, and international political economy. I now introduce Dr. Tamanisha John of Clark Atlanta University. Dr. John, unmute your microphone. Thank you.
Hi, hello, good night, good morning, good evening, wherever people are. I will say when I was first asked to be on this panel, I was a bit confused since I don't study social media per se. But after engaging with some of Mr. Roy's book and also listening to others on the panel today, I just want to talk about some of the details that I was able to gather from the book and the sorts of reflections I had on these details as they relate to the Global South, the Caribbean, and even in countries like the United States. So in the introduction of the book, Mr. Roy talks about social media commerce and its impact on human lives, specifically discussing how regular people become engaged in commercial activities on social media that enables capitalism to make profits both within and outside of the digital ecosystem. He also talks about how social media itself, while sometimes presented as a neutral sphere where we all have this ability to equally participate or let our voices be heard, still replicates much of the same divisions that we witness offline. For instance, you have blue check marks or follow only versus friend requesting options, which separate most people from those with influence or political authority, even in the social media atmosphere. And so the social media component, however, connects us to each other's lifestyles, making what we post, including the mundane, more relatable. Social media incentivizes us to consume given its relatability, even as this full fulfillment of relatability is based on continuous alienation under capitalism. So Roy notes that all social media has brought in a new way of living life itself by altering previously existing ways of life and creating lifestyle-centric ways of life where the possession and flaunting of commodities have become the norm. And so this raises the ever important question for political economists like myself, how do we make sure that big tech and the digital data that it extracts from all of us isn't used in ways that solely increase the profits and the power of the already entrenched capitalist classes in our societies? This is especially the case because big tech, like Big Brother, all comprise themselves of surveillance systems that regulate human behavior due to the material and social effects that they have on daily human life. And it is relevant that Roy examines Facebook as one of the social media sites in their work. As we see in the present, Facebook's base of elderly users are dying out. And in the West, those under the age of 25 are less likely to create Facebook accounts on a site that they see as being dominated by older generations. Now, of course, while Facebook's solution to this problem, as was advertised, especially in the West, is the metaverse, and it received a lot of this hype because you could digitally be in some virtual reality world, what is important here is how Facebook actually plans to save itself from what translates into a falling rate in profit. And this necessarily means that Facebook and other big tech social media giants facing a crisis of demographics and or competition from sites like TikTok will need new markets to expand into. And of course, by new markets, this means expanding and exploiting those people not yet connected in poorer parts of the developed world, but more specifically to those poorer parts of the world that comprise the formerly colonized countries, or today what we call the global south or developing countries. Facebook has already announced its mission to get more people online by extending the internet into more areas of the world, which they did say will include places like the Caribbean. And this is because in the global south, there are large populations of people who do not have consistent access to the internet or internet capable devices to download all of these social media apps. And it is also the case that in some places like China or Iran, there are restrictions on US big tech companies and their social media sites. What is interesting in Roy's work is that they discuss at length how our lives are appropriated by tech as productive. We become the commodity that innovates and the consumable goods on these social media sites for advertisers and even for our own regular personal networks and communities. Taken together with capital's need to expand, we can recognize modern social media or technological innovation as the appropriation of human life that then reaches a boom or its height first in the developed world before engaging in foreign direct investment schemes into new developing markets where the same patterns of inequitable distribution and exploitation of ourselves, our lives, and our time become replicated all over. The classic tale of capitalist exploitation. And given the sheer size of these entities, the obvious threats they pose to weaker states and people's sovereignty is always in the background. And Ms. Noguera just spoke about that as well. What is frightening about human commodification in the social media realm, outside of the fact that it extends capitalism's lifeline, is how it renders our own oppressions and exploitation within it invisible. So Roy also takes time to talk about commodity fetishism and reification processes where we are all socially structured and coerced into thinking about each other in a manner that sees them and ourselves as things that we can profit from, as mere profit-bearing objects. And he also spoke about how this reification process gives us a sort of spectator social stance within these social media sites. And because of that, our ideological and practical struggle against capitalism and the necessitated exploitation under it becomes obscured as the cost, the social labor that we put into these things ourselves are made invisible as soon as the object becomes a consumable commodity. Something else that I wanted to talk about is that the way our labor and exploitation is rendered invisible in the social media and tech realm, where we see ourselves simply reproducing or sharing our lifestyles, is very similar to the housewifeization of women who in the developed countries were some of the first targets of at-home electronics. And today, whether in the developed or the developing world, comprise a mass majority of today's online blog and website writers. In chapter 7, Roy talks about middle-class women in India and their online entrepreneurship, selling crafted items and jewelry. And this made me think about how social media gives this illusion of making women hyper-visible and the kinds of lifestyles that women are expected to share to show a fulfilling life on it. And this often leads to sharing that they are productive in the home and or can become independent sellers or even pretty influencers on their own through a social media marketplace that again extends the lifeline of capitalism, ignoring that women's subjection is also necessitated under that same capitalist patriarchal system. And these types of hypervisibility into this marketized social media process necessarily produces violent reactions to it. Social media has also given rise to our global understandings of incels and alpha males, all intent on making women relearn their traditional place while asserting men's rights, which is necessarily men's rights to use violence to dominate or render women's labor invisible. When I was in Guyana this summer, I was shocked to see younger cousins consuming alpha male rhetoric from popular Western YouTubers. And this is also part of the phenomenon that Dr. Envy spoke about today that I think is worth saying again. Social media impairs rather than incites critical thinking. Earlier, Roy mentioned that whenever profits are involved, we need to examine the contradictions between capital and labor. And of course, following the impact of these technological devices and social sites into the developing countries in the global South, one must ask how these new intrusions will also facilitate the commodification of previously unmarketable spheres of people's lives there. That necessarily means the increasing indebtedness of not just states in these regions, but also of its people which live and exist in them, who will attempt to replicate the lifestyles of those in the developed countries for these apps. It is already the case that Guyana, Trinidad, Barbados, and Jamaica have governments and state-sponsored tourism boards which uplift Western influencers who come to their countries to take photos and attract tourists to them. It is also true that import bills have increased to match these new and imported desires that people have due to social media. I think a lot about how more people in Guyana want an iPhone, for instance, which is already expensive, so much so that they have dupes notorious for having batteries that don't work at all. You also have banks in these countries introducing new credit systems for the people within them. And now, of course, these new technologies will help to facilitate these social media transactions in the global South, branding themselves as emancipatory, allowing anyone to become an entrepreneur. And we already see this process long happening on WhatsApp, where it primed regular people in the Caribbean to advertise products for sale in their stories or to advertise parties and events to their peers, even if they were not officially part of the promotion teams or owning a stake in the promotion itself. And what this points to me is a sort of reinforcement of the hustle or gig economy, given the underdevelopment produced by capitalism for the mass majority. And yet, what will become sexy to talk about as it regards the Caribbean region, of course, is the impact of new technologies on crime, which necessarily produces a rhetoric of increased surveillance on those states' populations and justifies things like the war on drugs, laundering, terrorism, trafficking by developed states to infinity. Even these logics become imported and branded onto the region, emphasized greatly by the fact, as Mr. Noguera pointed out earlier, keeps Caribbean and African people on the digital margins because it is foreign owned, not locally owned and thus imported. And this is not to suggest that the effects will look similar everywhere or everywhere is similar, but rather to point out how these logics are already and have already been exported to these places, given already existing stereotypes forced onto the region and states under capitalism already. Roy points out that even though social media plays a crucial role in the nexus of commodities becoming part of everyday lives of people, and even though when some commodities are economically viable, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're culturally significant enough for the people. I kept thinking about how much harder it still is for us in the developed world to have a mass consciousness or awareness of imperialism, even with technologies that purport to bring us closer together in our alleged global community. Instead, as agents largely wielded by capitalists for their own benefit, social media and technological innovations that happen by people under capitalism make the gaps wider between those who have and those who do not, and render invisible the labor of those producing the technological devices that we use to get on these social media platforms that further alienate us from one another to benefit capitalism. Now, of course, the question is always, how do we use these devices and these social sites for our own benefit to make clear that exploitation is happening for some revolutionary end goal, especially when the purpose of these devices and these sites are to give us the illusion of community, togetherness, and fulfillment. I'm going to conclude by noting that Roy ends by addressing this and saying that technological innovations do not allow human beings to imagine the end of capitalism, but rather they manifest in the most profound images of capitalist realism, where capitalism is imagined not only as an extremely stable system, but also as a system that simply has no alternative. And yet there is no suggestion for how we can approach others on the topic presented. Freedom means the complete rejection of capitalism itself. Yes, and still. I was in a Black Alliance for Peace session yesterday where we were discussing surveillance capitalism, living in one of the most surveilled cities in the US. And we were talking about how people buy these Ring cameras, which aids in surveillance of their neighbors, allegedly for safety purposes. And yet, if people knew their neighbors and talked to their neighbors, these cameras wouldn't even need to be necessary and wouldn't produce these mini citizen police officers in essence. And how it should be made clear that the benefits of knowing one's neighbors helps communities not only feel safe, but fight processes of gentrification or mass evictions from happening. And precisely because there is no incentive under capitalism to know your neighbors or to actually build a real community, people are left struggling on these sites seeking validation. So I was left wondering, what is a suggestion that could be made to change people's relationship with social media, since simply stating log off or delete the app doesn't reach people, and it won't happen. It isn't enough to say, get off the app if alternatives aren't imagined and shared, especially because the participatory nature of social media does give some people this sense of belonging, even if to what they belong to is not yet fully clear. As Roy mentioned in his presentation today, social media allows people to overemphasize the benefits of social movements that happen on and from these sites versus interrogating these hidden processes of exploitation that happen every day and in far greater numbers on the exchanges and transactional interactions on these sites, which have far-reaching negative consequences. And I will end there.
Thank you very much, Dr. John, and thanks to all the other speakers, Mr. Roy, Dr. ND, and Mr. Noguera. We were given a lot of food for thought by every speaker here. Mr. Roy spoke about ethical consumption. Mr. Noguera spoke about telecolonialism, which is a new word. Dr. ND spoke about the issue of enslavement. In terms of the enslavement of people to these media. And Dr. John continued to speak about the exploitation of women. One of the things I remember when Malcolm Forbes, the founder of Forbes magazine, he named his plane Capitalist Tool. And it was very instructive. And now I look at social media, and to me, what is emerging is that social media is just another capitalist tool. You know, I think somebody made the point about given time, we'd understand it. We understood the robber barons and the oil companies, we understood them. And so we resisted them. But social media, to me, came in a more insidious manner. And that is why I think we have to discuss it over and over and over from a people's point of view to give our own interpretation on our own direction to this thing. I remember one of the persons from Facebook came to Trinidad. She was a senior vice president or something. And the way people were speaking about this person is like if she was a revolutionary. They were speaking about these guys like Bill Gates as if they were revolutionary figures who were doing positive things in the world. And this impression that we got is because we were given a narrative by the creators of social media. So a lot of food for thought. And so at this point in time, I would open the floor for questions to those who will have questions. Please try to keep your questions short. We have a number of people here who would like to ask questions. So the floor is now open for questions.
Just a quick statement. I think Dr. John hit it on the head. You summed it up perfectly. If we understand that social media across the platform is nothing more than a capitalist tool, you now understand the beast you're dealing with. And all the upsides of what it can do is not what it was intended to do. And they will always make certain that the intent when it was created will live out, will be able to live, to create itself over and over again. I think you summed it up beautifully. And I think that gives our young people a lot to think about, because asking them just to sign off is not the solution. Having them understand what they are participating in, then that gives them a choice to think about something differently. And it doesn't matter whether there's an upside or a downside to it, it's understanding what it is. And for that, I thank you, Dr. John.
Dr. Vincent have a question, or Dr. John wanted to respond? Dr. John, do you want to respond?
No, I was just shaking my head. I really,
Okay, Godfrey? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, all four speakers, there's a common thread about making the relationship between social media and capitalism. And I would like any one of the speakers to further broaden and talk about that relationship, because, and what we always, sometimes we have this important discussion about about neoliberalism, and I'm trying to link the whole idea of social media and neoliberalism and how it impacts people's social consciousness in terms of hierarchy and capitalism. So could anyone willing to address that?
Let me have Dr. Roy answer that, since his work is the focus of that issue.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so yeah, thank you for the question. See, the basic issue that we are facing with social media today, and yeah, first thing is that I should thank Dr. John for doing a better summary of my book than I did. Okay, thank you, thanks for that. But yeah, so what we are seeing under contemporary modes of neoliberal capitalism is that what social media has done, that see, there are methods of accumulation which have gone on for years now in social media, and both Felipe and Bill. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but both Felipe and Bill have talked about data mining and processes which come around with social media. Now, what I actually talk about in the book specifically is that these are direct methods of accumulation. That you put up ads, somebody sees them, the company pays you, you are done. You get that money, it's done. But what Facebook has become, or what social media in general has become today, under neoliberalism specifically, because we have all sorts of things which come under neoliberalism. And that's consumerism, consumption, like hyper consumption, etc., etc. It's all these ideas about shop till you drop dead and all that kind of stuff. Brand culture, etc., etc. I have, like, in the book, I take, yeah, a significant portion of that is about brand culture, and I do talk about that as well. But under neoliberalism, what has happened is that these platforms such as Facebook, Twitter, Instagram have become sort of manipulators of people's lives. They are actually manipulators of people's lives, which is similar to how Dr. Bill actually talked about enslavement. That these are actually, and I'll tell you how they are manipulators, because they perform the dual function. They perform a dual function in this regard. They actually directly take money from the ad people who sort of provide them with ads. That's one sort of revenue stream that they have. The other sort of revenue stream that they have is by directing the cash flow in the market, because the kind of processes that I was talking about is largely about cash flow. It's largely about directing the cash flow in the market. For example, 90% even in India these days, this trend has come about that if you need something, you actually first look up on Amazon. You don't find it on Amazon. You look up at some of the indigenous marketing apps or marketing websites which are there, shopping websites, e-commerce websites which are there, which are performing very badly, like in competition to Amazon. The next thing that they look at is on social media, is on Facebook or Instagram. And so basically the competition right now on a very practical scale is between Amazon and like this entire meta universe of Facebook and Instagram at this moment, especially in the context of India, what's been happening. And so this is actually a huge problem. And this is where neoliberalism actually comes up, because it is with neoliberal capitalism that you see this proliferation of profit-driven schemes or profit-driven plans and programs which have come about, and which actually something that these platforms personify. And that is, I think, if we're talking about broadening the scope of this entire discussion regarding the relationship between social media and capitalism, then currently we need to look at social media not only as a part of capitalism, of course it's a part of capitalism, but what it is doing now is that it's actively playing the role of a facilitator of more and more capitalist exploitation. And it's largely doing that in strictly, it was already doing that on cultural and social terms. Now it's doing it on political economic terms, influencing directly people's lives. And in that regard, I would like to introduce one term that I use in the book, and I actually kind of forgot that when I was doing my presentation, is that what social media is doing, it's kind of creating a marketization of the society. It's kind of creating a marketization. Like when you have this amount of freedom to trade, you have this amount of freedom to put everything up for sale and all. And putting everything up for sale is again another trait, classical trait of neoliberal capitalism in the global south. So you actually look at the entire society as a market, and that's what has happened to most of the communities in the in places such as India. Like even the town that I come from, today there are vast networks operating on WhatsApp which actually sell basically everything. And these are usually the stuff which people used to prepare not for the purpose of selling. They used to prepare it for either donating or shared consumption within the community. Now these are just commodities up for sale. So this is one of the, but yeah, I've gone on for too long. Sorry. Yeah,
no problem.
Yes,
go ahead. Yeah.
I also want to try to address, I think it was Mr. Vincent's question about social media and neoliberalism and its sort of impact on people's social consciousness. And so I would say that social media, as well as the incentives pushed by neoliberal policies, at once serve to heighten our beliefs in the sort of capitalist individualistic logic, meaning that we view ourselves separate from others. And you see this popularized by phrases such as "no one owes you anything" and "you don't owe anyone anything," that are very popular on social media. And that because we are all equally buying into this notion of, phony individualism and individualism as being what's uplift us, we're all able to equally exploit ourselves or become famous, the social media phenomenon of wanting to become famous. And it makes it so that when you are unable to profit off of your lifestyle, it decreases your individual sense of self-worth. It doesn't do any reflection on what these apps are for, who becomes famous and why, how algorithm works. It makes you internalize every issue as an individual issue. Your lifestyle isn't good enough, or whatever it is that you're doing isn't good enough. And another social media site that I think highlights this, for instance, since we have a lot of young people on the call, is OnlyFans. The majority of men and women on OnlyFans, for instance, make less than $200 a month. And what they're posting on there, the content that they're posting is selling their body, whether it's for fitness or for sex or pornographic needs. And that's selling your body, the mass majority of them making less than $200 a month, yet OnlyFans is still advertised as a social media app where you have the ability to profit, make money off of your own body. And I think that when we think about body images and bullying and dysmorphia and all of that stuff, it comes because you have people who are buying into this notion of individuality that's incentivized by social media, and also the lifestyle itself that they're living that's just supposed to blow up because people are able to relate to it. And when they can't, people become defeated instead of understanding that every single person cannot become famous from social media, right? And so hierarchies still exist in these spaces. And what they push is a nasty case of individualism that they make people buy into it, still view it as real. And that's why I mentioned that it's not enough to say just get off, because a lot of people think that it is real.
Okay, Dr. Yvette Esunga has a question. Ms. Esunga. Did I pronounce it correctly, Esunga?
You did great. Thank
All right.
you. Thank you. Well, first, thank you to all the panelists. This is a great discussion. This is also a serious discussion, I think. And I wanted, well, I absolutely acknowledge the economic power, fake or real, that social media is giving to many today, to the point where they're even called influencers. I'm not sure what that means, but yes, there is that economic power of social media today that may cause even our students to think they may not need the education that was first thought of as necessary to become quote unquote successful. But I wanted to, if you will allow me, to go back to something that Dr. ND mentioned, and that has to do with the force for division that social media is appearing to increasingly become. And I'm thinking about not only here in our country, but I'm sure in the Caribbean, in Africa, absolutely. Many times individuals call from home, and they seem to know so much about so much regarding what is happening here in America. And also what we saw happening, that is still happening actually, where social media is really pitching people against each other. So I just wanted for any of the panelists to maybe also address these facets of social media. Thank you.
Okay. Dr. Anderson, she mentioned you. Yes. Unmute your mic, please. Yeah.
Thanks, Dr. Esunga, for that very brilliant question. And you have raised a very important point, especially talking about the economic power of social media. That economic power is what I call the dream that is selling a pipe dream to young people, because young people believe when they're on social media, it is a talking point I did not mention, that believe in the likes, that believe in the number of views. The more you make, the more views you have, the more money you can make. However, it is not everybody who writes on social media, who posts on social media, that will make that amount of views or money. The money-making aspect of it comes back to my narrative of a tool for enslavement. Because if you've been reduced to a slave who believes in the value of money more than any other value, then you lose the plot. It reminds me of a book title. It reminds me of a book title by an American titled $40 Million Slave, because they make the money on social media doesn't spare them from being slaves. Because they make the money, can they explain how the algorithms are configured to help them raise the money? That's a question I have. So it is not like we lose sight of, you know, those people called influencers. Influencers, who are they influencing? How are they influencing them? Are they influencing them with the right examples or with the wrong examples? Those are questions that would be up for debate. Maybe one of the other panelists has a thing or two to add, but I think that is a key thing that I addressed. And I actually pointed out that the fact that they make us reduce everything we have, even to our dirty linen, to our nakedness, to a commodity for consumption, it is monetized, not even to the benefit of those who are selling the information. It is monetized to the benefit of the social media or the big tech companies. So I would like us to rethink that even the people who benefit, when they benefit or they make the money, how much do the big tech make without them knowing? Let me rest there.
Thank you. Shakira Frederick has a question.
Yes, so I'm commenting on what Mrs. John said. While I do agree that social media is a breeding ground for insecurities within teenagers, I also have to point out, in my opinion, that since these insecurities are fostered usually at home or during physical, social relationships between peers and so on and so forth, that the issue isn't necessarily social media, but the environment in which the child has grown up in. Because insecurities are something that develops through, you know, seeing other people and hearing different comments and stuff like this. So while social media is kind of like, it's successful for a lot of things, they are good, they are bad, and there's the in-between, but it all boils down to how you were raised, the environment in which you were brought up in, what you are knowledgeable about, and what you are ignorant about.
Dr. John, do you want to respond?
Yes, I agree with that. I think what social media does, though, is it exposes people to other people's lifestyles that they wouldn't have otherwise seen, right? My family members and cousins in Guyana, they believe that every single person in the US has an iPhone. How come they don't have an iPhone? How come every single person in the US has all this time to take off of work and travel when they have to go and work in the mines? And so social media increases the amount of people that you compare yourself to. So even if you're raised in a household that tries to instill confidence in you, or you're raised in a community, since we're from a small village, that instills in you that you are worthy, social media allows you to make those comparisons. So even if you live in an environment where you're already put down, those put down feelings get exacerbated by social media. And if you are in an environment where you aren't being put down, social media exacerbates your insecurities because now you have more access to see what those people over there have that you personally don't have at your point in life. We also see this in rhetoric. By 24, by 20, I want to be able to have my own house and move out of my parents' house. That is not something that could be attained by the mass majority of people, yet that is something that is proliferated by the most influential influencers on these social media sites. And so there is a difference. Yes, some of it starts at the society level and how people are treated. And then there's also that component where even if people aren't bullied, now they're being exposed to the lifestyles that they wouldn't have had access to in the past or before.
Thank you. As Mr. Roy, I see your hand is up. Yes.
Yeah, I did. Actually, I'd just like to add up to two of the points that Dr. Andy mentioned and Dr. John mentioned right now to the response to the question. This issue about likes and views, actually, what I'd like to put out is that this actually point towards a larger, this is again related to this idea that Dr. Vincent mentioned, the impact of neoliberalism. That why are likes and views so important to young people is that one of the major issues is that what we are seeing and what, like, it's purely my opinion, that what we are seeing in under contemporary modes of capitalist production globally is that we are moving towards a more quantified society. We like to define ourselves by numbers. And that's why, and the biggest example of that is COVID, and how the number of deaths and the number of mortalities became the description of the state of the world. And everybody was discussing about that. Okay, this country is doing well because the number of deaths due to COVID were less. This country was doing bad because the number of deaths due to COVID was high. But nobody was actually talking about the subjective experiences of people with of people living there. That even in a society where the number of deaths were less, the subjective experiences of certain, the lived experience of people might be worse than a society where COVID, where the number of deaths was high. But like it's a bit of a paradoxical position to be in because yeah, but yeah, that is the point, that we live in a highly objectified society where numbers become the be all and end all of our social existence. Your bank account matters. Your bank account doesn't matter. Not as such that what bank you have an account, but the numbers associated with your bank account becomes the Bible of your life, quote unquote Bible of your life. That's one of the things. The other thing is that something that Dr. John mentioned right now. There's something that I even take up in the book itself, that this issue of comparing oneself to others, and how does social media feature in with all that. And what Dr. John mentions, I actually draw from there that what social media has done today is that it has sort of like, yeah, let me just narrate an incident which will make it clear. Like in one of the cities, in one of the social contexts in which I was conducting interviews, and it was Bangladesh. It was in Dhaka, which was just a neighboring country of India. And I was doing online interviews. And this thing actually came up that one of the respondents actually said that that person basically comes in from a middle class and very sort of working class, service class, not actually working class, but more service class background. That person didn't have the avenues to financial avenues in which that person could buy off certain stuff from the internet, or even that person just didn't have the money. He actually told me that Facebook Marketplace came as a boon to him because that helped him to elevate his social status. Basically, what he did was that he saw what everybody around him had. He checked that up online. He just couldn't afford the new things. So he bought of stuff from other people, used stuff from other people, and started using those. And then he said that he actually elevated my lifestyle in the community that I am, because now I'm carrying basically the same phone as everybody's carrying. I'm wearing basically the same clothes as everybody's wearing. So this, I think, this again leads us back to the kind of achievement society that capitalism likes to promote. That your kind of clothes you wear, the kind of phones that you carry, those are the actual markers of who you are, rather than, like, speaking in a very abstract sense, the kind of person that you are. And this is how social media actually features in all this, that it actually creates a crisis, like it actually harps on a crisis that capitalism has created. That the lifestyles are so poor that most of the people suffer from such a demented state of lifestyle that any opportunity that they get in elevating that, even if it is at the expense of selling their own dignity, like they are almost forced by the society to take that up. Yeah, that's it.
All right.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Mr. Noguera, your hand is up.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to say that on the question of neoliberalism, students don't get distracted. I mean, there's so much distraction on for comparisons on Facebook and TikTok and Instagram. There are a lot deeper issues, some of which have come up during the course of our discussion, and which you as young creators, as people getting ready to come out of school, you know, what are the alternatives to capitalism and capitalist accumulation? We've been talking about that throughout the discussion, but there's been no articulation of an alternative that we could possibly consider. And I dare to postulate that the collectivist approach to pooling resources, to looking at alternatives, not only to the existing applications, which we call social media, but to the basic infrastructure and how the infrastructure is moving, because we are at a fundamental point of shift in paradigm from the traditional capitalist system as we knew it, based on the petrodollar of the United States, to something that this war between Russia and the Ukraine has brought out the possibility of a different currency. And the currency that I'm talking about is not just a monetary currency, I'm talking about the way in which we communicate, the way in which we produce and distribute. And all I'm saying is, don't get so distracted by bling and who's doing what and all this nonsense that you miss some of the fundamental things that are taking place with the global political economy. And can use your imagination and self-determination to have an impact and not just simply be consumer.
Okay.
Can I make a point, please?
Hold 1 second, please. I wanted to make a point that Felipe mentioned. What are the approaches? And, you know, I have been part of the cooperative movement in Trinidad and Tobago. And we have tried to propagate the cooperative model as a way forward for social relations and economic relations. But the cooperative model is under assault by neoliberalism. And I hope at some point in time, someone can speak to that issue. The issue I want to speak about is this idea that was put in the public domain some years ago, the consumer as the ultimate citizen. What is citizenship? This is what we pride ourselves on. When we fought colonialism, slavery, we wanted to be citizens, to be part of. And now we have gotten that to some extent. We are seeing now the consumer as the ultimate expression of citizenship, which I would hope we could address. But Dr. Amy Agueli, I had a question, so please ask your question. Yeah, unmute your microphone, please.
Yes. So I, you know, before the last comment, I was thinking that we have to also probably see how we can use the platforms for mobilization in a positive way. And to do so would merit, for example, okay, today we are talking across countries. People with more useful models for society should use the platforms as much as possible, but then one has to recognize that it is also a surveillance tool. And so whatever you do and say would be part of the data that they're taking. But at the same time, I can see a possibility in the platforms being used against hegemony. And earlier today, I was having a look at James Yeku's work, Cultural Netizenship, which Indiana University Press. And he was actually arguing as well that the platforms have made it possible, to some extent anyway, to challenge the patriarchal Nigerians, well, not so much patriarchal, but dominating, hegemonic Nigerian state. And he would, in that text, he talks about, you know, the comedians and performative, you know, activities and activism challenging the state through social media and cutting across boundaries to get their points known. Of course, you know, we recognize that there are restrictions again, because the media is also a surveillance tool, data collection is taking place and all that. So one has to be very careful and also use various forms of coded discussions where necessary. But anyway, that was what I had in mind. Thank you very much.
Okay. Anyone want to address this issue of the consumer versus the citizen, and also what Dr. Emir Gweli mentioned, any of the panelists? Godfrey, yeah?
Oh, yeah, that is a very important point, which needs emphasis, because it relates to 1979, when Thatcher said there's nothing called a society, there are only individuals. That's the libertarian viewpoint of society. And therefore, with the neoliberal bent from that time to now, to your point, we are no longer seen as as citizens of a country. We have become consumers, and I think we have to impress those of who understand it. Have to impress on young people how did we get from being a citizen to now just being a consumer, and because social media really, and I think all the presenters made a point that social media has commodified things, which is part of capitalism, and have made a new generation or younger people or more people, even elder people, consumers. So I think this is a very important.
Yeah, I would like, because to me, the citizen is a sovereign being, complex, multifaceted. To me, the consumers are mindless thing you create to eat food, to buy clothes, to buy the best cars, to have materialist expectations and so on. And I think social media amplifies this mindlessness of the consumer as replacing the citizen and ultimately replacing any kind of collective sense of responsibility for each other, which has been part of our traditional societies. So I would want one of the panelists to please, if you have any opinions on that subject.
All right, let me come in there really quickly. Am I muted? Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Brother Akko. I remember I always have discussions with my students on issues like this before I even start teaching any of my classes. And I think the social media has made it very, very clear as I drop my speech talking about enslavement, that the social media user becomes so dependent on social media that they don't understand, or they don't even figure out that they are humans endowed with ability to create. And I think it is for our younger generation to start thinking about creativity, not just socializing on social media, not just blowing hot air and representing the self with that which is visible. Because what the social media does is to help young people put out what they have there. It might not be something of value, but they just have to put it out there. Whereas if our young people start conceiving not only from their environment, everything around them, from the point of view of creativity, they move away from consumerism. I tell my students, think of creating. If you are interested in video games, think of creating a video games that would have participate in it. Don't just be a consumer. And I think we have the tool. We have to instruct our young people to re-channel their vision. They shouldn't just jump into it. I appended my conversation by saying this tool is not understood by the younger generation. It is just like if we take a few steps back in our history. With the Industrial and Agrarian Revolution, they brought in changes that made us believe it was changes for the good. But those changes were not really for our good. And social media has just come in and added another layer of amplification. So I think I'll pause there. I see Brother Felipe's hand up, so I'll cede the floor to him.
I didn't mean to cut you, brother. I think I really agree with what you're saying. I think you're making a very important point. And a good example from the Caribbean is Martley, the Honorable Prime Minister of Barbados, has emerged as one of the champions of the small island developing states of trying to challenge the advantage to which Caribbean countries have been put by the metropolitan countries, etc. However, not long ago, we were talking to me about developing our own fiber optic cable, our own satellites, etc. We were engaging all of the ministers. Next thing you know, Meta comes in. And now they're the first ones in the Caribbean to establish a virtual reality embassy in the Middle East. And they've gone hook, line, and sinker with Zuckerberg. The problem with that is that you relinquish your autonomy. We relinquish our sovereignty when we relinquish our creativity. They can have a monopoly on the means of production. They can have a monopoly on the means of communication, but they cannot have a monopoly on our imagination unless we concede that. And that is what is at stake right now.
Thank you.
Dr. John.
Yes, so I wanted to say that even when we talk about the sovereign state system, I don't want us to get misguided into believing that we were ever really like these full citizens who didn't have sort of this relationship to consumerism. So our sovereign state system today is born out of colonialism and empire. And really the failure of the new international economic order in the 50s onto the 70s, when states in Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, et cetera, were becoming independent, meant that not only state relationships to Western capitalism, imperialism would inform the order of their continued underdevelopment and extraction by these rich states, but also the continued underdevelopment of people subjected to the Western capitalist and imperialist system, both within developed countries like the United States and also people abroad. And subjugation necessarily means a lack of consciousness, because you cannot subjugate people if they know that they are being subjugated, right? And so Mr. Roy, as many Marxists do in his book, they point out that forgetting is inherent to keep the false notions of capitalist development alive, right? So people have been kept ignorant of history since before social media. That's why you had people like Walter Rodney, Du Bois, et cetera, trying to say, hey, you Africans need to learn the history, right? But now in the age of social media, people are willingly misinformed about history, right? They're offered these new alternatives. And it's not just, the white capitalist that is feeding this information either. You have groups in the United States like ADOS, for instance, who they don't believe they're related to anyone in the Caribbean, anyone in Africa. They're the original indigenous peoples in the United States. Ludicrous notions. And again, a willing misinformation about history. And now you have this right-wing movement that started off in Republican offices and Tea Party groups that now Black people in the US have taken up as their own. African descendant of slaves, we're not immigrants, we are not Black immigrants, and we hate Black immigrants, right? And so the age of social media, again, it keeps these capitalist processes of negating history so that people would not know that they're being exploited. And the social media aspect just includes a multiplying of that sort of misinformation and willful neglect of history, so that people, they're saying stay woke and they're not woke, right? So that's like the irony in it.
One point, Dr. John, the famous statement from Steve Biko, the most powerful weapon in the hands of the colonizer, is the mind of the colonized. That was Steve Biko's one of the most profound statements. So our minds, and I remember Haile Gerima, the relaunch of Sankofa, he said the African continent has lost its mind, right? Based on what he's seeing. And so we go back again to this question of the mind and and the consciousness that you speak about, and which is why we have to continue to work on these issues of raising consciousness. Mr. Roy, I saw your hand is up. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. This is just to put up this sort of a continuation of Dr. John's statement and Felipe's statement as well. This like this idea of consumer citizenship. It's pretty much nothing but a form of neo-colonialism, especially when this idea is it's like sort of put up in the global south. Because like Felipe is absolutely right that most of these global conglomerates which put up offices in countries of the global south are actually trying, like to put it very bluntly, they're trying to take they're trying to promote a sort of they work on the same ethics as our colonizers once did, that is taking up from here, putting it somewhere up, this continuous flow of profits from the deprived communities to the rich ones. And that's what is actually happening. And this idea of this entire consumer as citizen or consumer as a citizen is based on that. And you especially make them so blunt or so inert that you actually can't sort of rebel back at certain things which are happening. Take like one of the easiest examples in that regard is Apple manufacturing units in China. This entire thing which comes up, or this Amazon, this entire Amazon warehousing system which operates, and like horrible facts have come up in the last recent years, but nobody actually questions that, and it doesn't actually impact a lot of people because their ability to consume, which is again heavily dependent on websites such as Amazon and websites and other brands such as Apple and other such issues, other such commodities, their ability to consume them has become one of the benchmarks on which they form their absolute citizenship that belongs in a particular area or in a particular social context. And that is where one of the issues, sort of the larger issues regarding social media lies. And like, yeah, just to put one more thing into context, and I won't take much time on this, is that I think the time has also come when we need to think of social media as a process in itself, because a lot of these like large conglomerates, including Amazon, and why I'm continuously referring the name of Amazon is because it's relevant to almost all of us, because all of us know Amazon. So what Amazon is doing in the context of India, specifically in the recent 6 to 8 months, is that it's trying to make its app and website a more participatory one. It wants its users to sort of talk to each other about products, shop together. And these are all things which Amazon has borrowed from social media. So I think in this context, and the last aim target is the same. It wants you to consume more. It wants you to buy more stuff from Amazon. So yeah, I'm not very clear about this because this is something that has recently come up. But yeah, we need to start thinking about social media as a process in itself. And this is something that Dr. Bill also mentioned, that this entire thing about social media, it's a commodity and a process at the same time. It's kind of a hybrid thing that has come up. And we need to sort of catch it on both its horns or something like that. Because
okay, thank you. We are running out of time, and I would like each panelist to make some parting comments before we leave for about 2 minutes. But I just want to, and we'll begin with Dr. John, and then we would follow it, Mr. Noguera, and so on and so forth. But I don't know if anyone has any final question. We'll entertain one more question. Godfrey?
Just another question, something for us to think about, and it just crossed my mind. We have to begin to think about the relationship in this dispensation of capitalism and social media, the building, how it is facilitating the building of fascism. And we are seeing it in terms of workers, the taking away workers' rights, you know. I mean, we talked about it the last time in a discussion. We talk about the technology and the jobless future, right? And we see, I just read something today while the discussion is taking place. Amazon is shutting down warehouses in the United States. Why? Because it is a retaliation to unionization. And so we have to begin to think about that relationship between social media and the building of the fascism and the rise of the far right.
Yeah. Before we do the thing, I have one announcement. Our next webinar will be on the 9th of October. The title is The Phenomenon of Aging, Challenges and Opportunities, Perspectives of the Caribbean and Beyond. So we will send communication out on that, but that's what we'll be discussing next. So we're at this point in time, we are almost at the 2-hour mark. We had set ourselves 1 hour and 45 minutes. So I will ask each panelist to make some closing comments, and we'll be for 2 minutes. I'll begin with Dr. John, please, and to be followed by Mr. Felipe Noguera. Dr. John?
Yes, so I'll make mine short and sweet. I want to thank you all for having me on the panel. And I also want to tell Mr. Roy that I really appreciated his book. I'm pretty sure he's going to be a great doctor once he gets out of his ABD stage. I think that he has a lot to add to our discourses on things that we use every day. And so again, thank you to all of the fellow panelists. Thank you to the 7 Continent Center for Research in Caribbean Policy and also Caribbean Dialogue. Thank you to everyone who attended the talk today. And I hope you all have a good morning, night,